It was April of 1964 in Memphis. Nearly 200 fans lined the windows of a car dealership, waiting to glimpse Elvis Presley behind the wheel of something new. Instead, they saw him ushered out the front doors by salesmen who wanted him gone. The silence that followed shook the city. The afternoon sun beat down on Madison Avenue, turning the glass facade of the dealership into a mirror. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wax and gasoline, the showroom floor gleaming with polished chrome. Salesmen in pressed suits lined the edges, their eyes darting to the door every few seconds. Word had spread quickly. Elvis Presley was coming at 29 years old. Elvis was already larger than life. Yet, when the door swung open, he didn't arrive with fanfare. He walked in quietly, sunglasses low, a navy jacket buttoned neatly, his stride measured. Behind him came two friends, and just off his shoulder stood Red West, the bodyguard who rarely left his side. For a moment, the salesmen froze, watching as though a film had started playing in their own workplace. Outside, the glass shook with the press of bodies. Fans leaned in, fogging the windows, some clutching Polaroid cameras, others simply staring, mouths open in disbelief. The king was in a car dealership, and that ordinary space became, for one afternoon, the most electric spot in Memphis. Elvis approached, a Cadillac Eldorado, its hood catching the harsh fluorescent lights. He placed one hand on the chrome and tilted his head, studying the curves. He didn't speak right away. That pause, that measured silence, was something he often used on stage. Here it made even the most seasoned salesman uneasy. One whispered to another, his voice low but carrying. "That's him." The words hung in the air, unnecessary but undeniable. The tension in the room was strange. Here was a man who could buy the entire lot if he wished, yet his presence carried the weight of performance. Every gesture was magnified. If he leaned in to check the dashboard, the crowd outside surged forward. If he adjusted his glasses, flashes popped against the window. For Elvis, this was the cost of fame. Every private decision played like a public act. Can you imagine walking into a store, knowing every eye was locked on you, every movement interpreted as theater? As he bent closer to the car, his reflection shimmered on the windshield. Behind him, Red West shifted his weight, scanning the room with a soldier's calm. Elvis ran his fingers along the door handle, as though testing the fit of something far deeper than metal and leather. A salesman stepped forward at last, his shoes clicking on the showroom tile. "Mr. Presley," he said, forcing a smile, "that one's a beauty." The words should have opened doors, but instead they began to close them. Elvis glanced up, nodded politely, and turned back to the car. His silence made the man shift uncomfortably. Somewhere behind, another salesman cleared his throat, whispering something sharp under his breath. Elvis heard it. Red West heard it too. In that instant, the bright lights of the showroom turned harsh. The air grew heavy, almost brittle, as if one wrong word could shatter it. Outside, the fans kept pressing, unaware that inside, something fragile was beginning to break. The stage was set for an embarrassment no one saw. Coming, Elvis bent closer to the Cadillac, peering through the glass at the cream-colored interior. The leather caught the light, glowing almost golden beneath the showroom lamps. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, weighing not just the machine in front of him, but the memory of all the Cadillacs that had carried him through long nights and sudden road trips. Cars had always been his way of gifting joy both to himself and to others. But the spell broke quickly. From behind the polished counter, a voice cut through the air. It was quiet at first, but sharp enough to land. He never really buys from here, just shows up. The words weren't meant for Elvis directly. They were muttered sideways, but they were loud enough to echo. Red West stiffened, his jaw tight, his frame shifting forward as though instinct told him to intervene. Elvis held still, not moving, his hand still resting lightly on the door handle. Silence pressed down over the room. Another salesman, perhaps trying to patch the awkwardness, stepped forward with a forced chuckle. Now, if you're not serious about making a purchase, Mr. Presley, we'll need to keep the floor clear. Busy day, you understand. The remark landed heavier than the first. A hush fell so fast that even the crowd outside sensed something was off. Their chatter dimmed. Cameras stilled against the glass. 200 people waited, their bodies tense, as though the very air had been pulled taut by invisible wires. Imagine, for a moment, standing in your own hometown, in a place where your music had once poured from every diner jukebox, only to be told you didn't belong. How would you react? Elvis slowly lifted his sunglasses just enough to meet the man's eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call on his fame. But the stare carried weight, a mixture of disbelief and quiet hurt. To be dismissed not as a customer, not even as a man, but as a distraction. It cut deeper than any critic's review. Red shifted again, his fists curling slightly at his sides. Say the word, he muttered under his breath. But Elvis shook his head almost imperceptibly. The second salesman, misreading Elvis' calm as hesitation, pressed on. We've got serious buyers waiting, sir. If you're not planning to sign papers today, maybe it's best you move along. Best you move along. The words struck like a gavel, final and humiliating. The fluorescent lights above seemed harsher now, bouncing coldly off the chrome. The showroom, once buzzing with whispered awe, turned into a stage for something uglier. And outside, the crowd leaned closer, sensing a change. They couldn't hear every word, but they could see Elvis's posture, the stiffened line of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. What would you do if strangers questioned your worth, your seriousness, in front of the very people who looked to you as larger than life? Elvis's hand slipped from the Cadillac handle. He stepped back, adjusting his jacket with deliberate calm. No argument, no raised voice, only silence, which somehow carried more tension than any explosion could have. The salesmen shifted uneasily now, unsure if they had gone too far, but unwilling to admit it. They gestured toward the door, and then, in a scene no one expected, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was shown the way out of a dealership in his own city. The moment was jarring. Fans outside gasped, their cheers collapsing into confusion. Some pressed harder against the glass. Others stepped back in stunned silence. Inside, reporters scribbled in notebooks, realizing they had just witnessed not a sale, but a story. The crowd outside sensed tension, their cheers dying into a hush. And in that hush, the first threads of humiliation began to weave into something far larger. The doors opened with a metallic creak, and the hot Memphis air rushed into the sterile showroom. Elvis stepped forward, his head slightly bowed, the sunglasses back in place. Behind him, Red West moved like a shadow, ready to shield his friend from the eyes outside. But no wall could protect Elvis now. The crowd had already seen too much. 200 faces stared through the glass. At first, they had pressed forward for autographs and photographs. But the moment the salesman's hands gestured Elvis toward the exit, everything shifted. Fans pulled back as though they'd been scalded. Their cheers fell into silence, and the silence itself grew heavy. It was the kind of silence that magnified every scrape of a shoe, every breath drawn too loudly. Outside, a teenager named Carl Jenkins, just 17, having hitchhiked from Tupelo to catch a glimpse of his hero, felt his heart pound. He had imagined Elvis striding out with keys in hand, waving, smiling, larger than life. Instead, he saw him ushered out like an uninvited guest. The boy would never forget that contrast. Inside, one of the reporters from the commercial appeals scribbled furiously in his notebook, circling words like dismissed, embarrassed, rejected. He wasn't writing about a man buying a car anymore. He was chronicling a wound delivered in front of witnesses. Red West stepped forward, his broad shoulders tense. His eyes locked onto the salesman who had told Elvis to move along. For a split second, the atmosphere threatened to snap. Red had been with Elvis long enough to know the sting of disrespect, and his fists were ready to answer. But again, Elvis raised his hand gently, halting him. That gesture carried weight. It said, "Not here. Not now." The fans on the sidewalk pressed closer, the glass vibrating under their palms. Some shouted his name, Elvis. Elvis, hoping to break the spell. Others stood frozen, unwilling to interrupt what felt like a private humiliation playing out in public view. Can you recall a time when someone you admired, someone untouchable in your eyes, suddenly seemed vulnerable? Did it make you feel closer to them more? Did it shake your belief in their strength? Elvis reached the doorway, the sunlight washing over him like a spotlight. But instead of applause, there was an uneasy quiet. A man who had filled arenas with deafening screams now walked through an audience gone dead silent. It was a silence sharper than any boo. The salesmen lingered behind the glass, their faces stiff, their arms folded. Some looked smug, others uneasy, as if realizing too late what they had set in motion. But there was no taking it back. In a matter of minutes, they had turned the king of rock and roll into a figure walking away from a stage not of his making. The reporters exchanged glances. One whispered, "This will run tomorrow." Another, already imagining headlines, muttered, "Front page." Elvis adjusted his sunglasses, but those closest to him swore they saw a flicker of hurt pass across his face. He didn't lash out. He didn't shout. But his silence was thunder. What happened next would decide how this moment would be remembered. Would it fade as just another story of celebrity arrogance? Or would it become something more, a lesson in dignity, and a turning point in how compassion can rewrite humiliation? On the sidewalk of Madison Avenue, the crowd waited for his next move. Reporters in the back scribbled notes, sensing a story that would ignite headlines. The air outside the dealership was thick, humid, almost sticky. Elvis stood on the sidewalk, the crowd forming a half circle around him. Cameras flashed sporadically, their light bouncing off his sunglasses. Behind him, Red West muttered, "Say the word E, I'll handle it." But Elvis didn't answer. He could have. He had the power to humiliate the men who had just pushed him aside. A single call to Colonel Parker, a lawyer, or even the local papers, and the dealership's reputation would be tarnished overnight. Yet Elvis didn't reach for revenge. He adjusted his jacket, inhaled deeply, and turned his head across the street. There, gleaming under the same Memphis sun, sat another dealership, smaller, less polished, but buzzing with nervous energy as word spread that Elvis Presley was standing in plain view. The decision formed quickly. Elvis stepped off the curb. 1 step. 2 steps. 3. The hush of the crowd followed him, broken only by the faint clicking of typewriter keys from a reporter who had brought his portable machine. Red glanced at him, unsure, but stayed close. By the time Elvis reached the rival dealership doors, the fans were trailing behind. A living tide of anticipation. Inside, the smaller showroom erupted in gasps. Unlike the cold reception he had just endured, here the salesmen nearly tripped over themselves to greet him. One stammered, "Mr. Presley, what an honor, sir. Please, come in." Elvis removed his sunglasses slowly. His eyes were calm, but there was a fire behind them. He looked around the room, then said softly, "I'd like to see what you've got." The effect was immediate. Papers shuffled. Keys jingled. Doors swung open. Rows of Cadillacs, Chevrolets and Buicks waited like soldiers at attention. The rival staff knew they weren't just showing cars. They were being handed a moment in history. Elvis walked deliberately down the line of vehicles. He stopped at a convertible, sky blue with white trim. He opened the driver's door, sat inside, and ran his fingers over the wheel. "I'll take this one," he said simply. The salesman blinked. "Wonderful choice, sir." "We can draw up the no," Elvis interrupted gently, his voice firmer now. He pointed toward the glass wall where fans pressed their faces eagerly. "I want a few more." For them, the words detonated. For a moment, no one moved. Then Red broke into a grin, slapping his hand against his thigh. The salesman's jaw dropped. "You mean?" Elvis nodded. "Let's get the papers ready. I'll buy several today. They've been waiting long enough." What would you have done in that moment? Would you have walked away, carrying the sting of insult? Or would you have turned it into an act of defiance wrapped in compassion? By late afternoon, signatures filled contracts. Keys were placed in neat piles on a polished desk. Elvis reached for them one by one. He didn't keep them. He turned and walked toward the crowd outside. The hush broke. People surged forward, hands trembling, voices rising in disbelief. Elvis held up the first set of keys and called out, "This one's yours." He dropped them into the palm of Carl Jenkins, the boy who had hitchhiked from Tupelo. The teenager froze, then broke into tears as the crowd erupted. Another set of keys flew into the hands of a mother clutching to children. She collapsed against the hood, weeping. Strangers clapped. Reporters scrambled. The humiliation across the street had transformed into ovation here. Elvis didn't stop. He kept handing out keys, convertible, sedan, coupe. Each one became more than steel, and rubber it became a symbol. And in front of hundreds, the king of rock turned rejection into generosity. The hush turned into wild applause. The parking lot outside the rival dealership had become something no showroom designer could have planned. A stage where generosity unfolded under the open sky. Engines hummed as brand new cars were rolled forward, their paint glistening in the last rays of afternoon light. The crowd pressed in tight, nearly 300 strong now, spilling into the street, straining for a better view. Elvis stood at the center, keys jangling lightly in his hand. He wasn't smiling broadly, nor was he grandstanding. His face carried something steady-eyed determination, tempered by quiet joy. He had turned what could have been an ordinary purchase into a spectacle of kindness. Each handoff of a key struck the air like a cymbal crash, drawing gasps and cheers. The first recipient, Carl Jenkins, still clutched his keys, staring at the gleaming convertible as though it might vanish if he blinked. Beside him, a middle-aged mother named Ruth Ann cradled her set of keys to a pale green sedan, tears running freely down her cheeks. Her children bounced at her side, too young to understand the weight of what had just happened, yet old enough to feel the electricity of the crowd's awe. Strangers hugged. Men in work shirts slapped each other on the back, shouting, "Only Elvis. Only Elvis would do this." The words rippled outward, swelling into a chant that rolled over the parking lot like thunder. Keys flew. Strangers cried. The asphalt itself seemed to vibrate with applause. What would you have thought, standing there that day? Would you have seen it as luck, fate, or proof that compassion has a louder echo than humiliation? Red West watched from the sidelines, shaking his head with a grin that barely contained his pride. "That's Elvis," he muttered to a reporter. "He won't fight small men. He'll just outgive them." Each gift reshaped the humiliation across the street. The rival dealership's windows, once gleaming in anonymity, now reflected a carnival of kindness. Car doors slammed shut as recipients sat inside, touching steering wheels as if they were holy relics. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras snapped, and the story was already becoming legend before the ink could dry dot. At one point, Elvis leaned down to a boy of about 10 who had squeezed his way through the crowd. The child's eyes were wide, his voice shaking. "Mr. Elvis, is this real?" Elvis smiled faintly and tapped the keys against the boy's palm. "It's real, son." The crowd roared again, louder this time, like an ovation in an arena. By the time the final keys were gone, the lot resembled the aftermath of a parade confetti of paperwork drifting in the breeze. Headlights cutting through the dusk, and strangers driving away in disbelief. Yet no one left without carrying a story, a memory that would outlive the cars themselves. What happened next became folklore, retold for years in barbershops, diners, and living rooms, not the insult at the first dealership, but the eruption of generosity on the asphalt across the street by dawn the next morning. The presses had already done their work. The Memphis Commercial Appeal carried a bold headline stretched across the fold. "Elvis buys cars for strangers after dealer snub." Smaller papers across Tennessee followed suit. Some called it a stunt, others a miracle, but all agreed it was unforgettable. Bootleg photographs emerged within days. Grainy black and white images showed Carl Jenkins gripping the wheel of his convertible. A dazed grin plastered across his teenage face. Another photo captured Ruth Ann, her children clambering in the back seat of the pale green sedan, her eyes still swollen from tears. These snapshots became artifacts, circulated like sacred relics in scrapbooks and pin-up boards. At the rival dealership, pride turned into permanence. The bill of sale bearing Elvis Presley's signature was framed and mounted in the showroom. A plaque beneath it reading, "April 1964, the day generosity drove these doors open." Visitors stopped to stare, not at a car, but at a piece of living history. For the families who received cars, the gifts became more than transportation. Carl Jenkins drove his convertible for years, each dent and scratch telling its own story. When he grew older, he never traded it in. He kept it as a monument, rolling it out on Sundays to remind his children and, later his grandchildren, that once Elvis Presley had handed him a set of keys in front of hundreds, and Ruth Ann. Her sedan carried her to jobs, doctor's visits, and church services. She often told neighbors, "This car isn't just metal, it's mercy." Long after the vehicle broke down, she kept the keys on her kitchen wall, hanging from a hook like a family heirloom. Reporters revisited the incident in later years, each time finding new witnesses eager to share how the arena went dead silent when Elvis first stepped onto the sidewalk, and how that silence transformed into thunderous cheers. The original insult faded into footnote. The legend that remained was one of compassion conquering humiliation. Which stories do we carry longer in history, the cutting insults or the kindness that follows them? Perhaps both linger, but one always outshines the other, even decades later. Fans who hadn't been there swore they remembered it. The tale passed through word of mouth, gaining color and detail with every retelling. In some versions, Elvis gave away 10 cars. In others, it was 15. The numbers mattered less than the moral. The salesman who dismissed him, his name disappeared into obscurity, but Elvis' response, the keys dropped into trembling hands, became a parable retold in schools, churches, and fan clubs across America. The insult that started it all had been erased by compassion. In the end, what lingered wasn't the insult inside the Madison Avenue showroom. It wasn't the smug look of a salesman, or the humiliation of being asked to move along. What endured was the response, measured, deliberate, rooted not in anger but in grace. Elvis Presley showed the world that true power doesn't come from wealth or even fame. It comes from restraint, from choosing compassion when pride begs for revenge. On that hot Memphis afternoon in 1964, he could have lashed out. He could have made phone calls that destroyed reputations overnight. Instead, he crossed the street, opened his wallet, and widened his heart. The scene plays back like a parable. On one side of Madison Avenue, a business shut its doors to him. On the other side, he opened doors for strangers. That contrast became the heartbeat of the story, the reason people still tell it nearly 60 years later. Imagine standing in that crowd. You expected to see Elvis behind the wheel of another Cadillac, maybe waving on his way home. Instead, you saw him hand keys to a boy, a mother, and others who had no reason to believe their lives would change that day. How would it have reshaped your idea of what generosity can look like? The gifts themselves, metal engines, rubber would one day wear down. Tires would bald, paint would chip, transmissions would grind. But the memory, that would remain polished, untarnished by time. Even the city of Memphis, a place that had seen Elvis rise from poverty in Tupelo to the pinnacle of stardom, carried the tale as a reminder: dignity can be defended not with fists or fury, but with compassion made public. The crowd didn't cheer for horsepower or chrome. They cheered for the sight of a man refusing to let insult be the final word. And perhaps that is where Elvis' real legacy lies, not only in his music, not only in the gold records and sold-out arenas, but in the quiet moments where he chose kindness over retaliation. In those moments, he wasn't just the king of rock and roll. He was the king of grace. If your pride was tested in front of hundreds, what choice would you make? Would you strike back, or would you rise above? The people of Memphis never forgot the day the arena went dead silent, then erupted when Elvis turned rejection into generosity. They didn't retell the salesman's insult. They retold the gift. Because in the end, humiliation fades. But compassion, true compassion, changes forever. Stories like this remind us that dignity isn't proven in anger, but in kindness. If this moment from Elvis's life moved you, share it with someone who believes compassion can rewrite any insult. And tell us, what's the most unforgettable act of generosity you've witnessed?